Well, good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Just a note, we're getting close to the 25th anniversary, so that's kind of exciting. We've been doing this program for 25 years, but I don't know if Mother Angelica anticipated that, but it's been a real blessing. And again, I want to thank all of you for your emails and support, for the way the stories on this program have been encouragement to your faith. So once again, we have this Journey Home program, and we're going to do it a little differently tonight. Of course, our normal preference is to have my guest here across the table from me, face to face, but especially during the time of COVID, that became difficult, and so we've had to do a number of programs at a distance. But my guest tonight, Dr. Larry Chapp, he's, I guess for want of a better word, we call him a Catholic revert, former Evangelical Protestant. I would have preferred to have Larry right here across from me, but we can't. And I think the main reason has to do with goats. Is that true? Is that true, Larry?
Yes, we just recently got here on our farm back into dairy goats. And since I am the only person on this farm that can milk the goats, that's the downside of having a dairy animal, is, as you well know, Marcus, you have to milk them every day, and I'm the dude for doing it. I've got to get some other folks trained up, but right now I'm chained here.
Is a goat twice a day?
Yes, well, you can do a goat once a day, but if you want maximum production, you should do it definitely twice a day. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Back when our family had a Jersey cow, and I was, as you said, the primary milker, although at the time my three sons were all home, and so my sons could fill in, especially when I had to make the trip to Birmingham and back. But in time, we went to once a day for that very reason. It just was too demanding, yes. Every 12 hours. Yes. And in the way that small farms have changed, the one thing we don't have anymore are very many people within 50-mile radius that can fill in the gap when you want to go do something else.
Oh, that's true. It's I have just recently discovered some people who could farm sit for me and know how to milk goats and so, but they're on vacation in Washington State. Actually, it's a fellow that you've had on your show before, Marcus Daly. He and his wife Kelly are now out in Washington State, but they'll be back here in our neck of the woods. But it doesn't help me right now.
Well, it's great, Larry, to have you on the program. It really is. And you were, in a way, you and I are recent friends. And I'd say that the two reasons I got to know you are a retired, for the audience, a retired professor of theology from DeSales University who retired from theology to start a Catholic worker farm.
Yes.
Which I really hope, I know we'll have time in the later part of the program to talk about. So when I heard about you on the internet, that's when I connected to your blog site, which is gaudium@spes22.com, which I highly recommend. And I'm kind of thinking, Larry, that when you retired from theology and you went to the farm, you thought you could relax. I don't know if you anticipated kind of a rebirth of your theological voice.
Yeah, I didn't. I thought that I was just going to retire to being a gentleman farmer with my fancy welly boots and walking about the farm, checking out my sheep and whatnot. And it turns out it was a lot more work than I expected. You know, I'm originally from Lincoln, Nebraska, so people often assume that I knew a lot about farming just because I'm from an agricultural state, but I knew nothing. I knew absolutely nothing. I grew up in the city of Lincoln, and I didn't know anything about farms. So there's the University of YouTube, which so my wife Carrie refers to me as the YouTube farmer because I learned almost everything from either YouTube or my neighbor up the street, Bob Hallowich.
That's another way you and I are we're brothers in this because I'm the same way. No farming background at all, and it's with books and YouTube. Yeah. But we'll get to that. Let me back off.
Yeah.
And we'd like to, if it could, invite you to start from the beginning and let's hear about your journey.
All right. Well, as I've already alluded to, I mean, I was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in many ways, I always like to point out that my upbringing was very, very typical, very Midwestern. 60s. I was born in 58, so 1960s and 70, Midwestern America. My parents were Catholics. I was born a Catholic, a cradle Catholic, baptized Catholic. But our family wasn't extremely religious, and I was a very bookish and precocious boy. And if my parents are watching, I'm not trying to say my parents were pagans. They weren't. They got us all sacramentalized. But I went to public school, did not go to Catholic school, and got all the proper sacraments and whatnot. But I grew up a very precocious, sort of nerdy little bookish kid who liked to hang out in his bedroom lair reading books. But early on in life, I was very smitten with science, evolution, astronomy, physics, these sorts of things. So like I said, I was a very nerdy, precocious, bookish kid. I'm sitting in my basement reading, and I became convinced that God did not exist. I became a fire-breathing little 10-year-old atheist who was all into science on a very superficial level. And I kept going to church because my parents would go to church, but I'm sitting there thinking, well, when can we get out of here so we can go to Perkins and I can get breakfast? So,
I was going to say it's interesting. You and I are so much parallel, but I wanted to ask you a question. And if your parents are listening, I don't want in any way set up an embarrassing conversation here. But you and I've heard you talk about that people that want to make the church before Vatican II look like it was just beautiful and everything was great. And so now we want to go back to it, but we recognize that there were issues before Vatican II, especially with an awful lot of Catholics. They were regular, but the faith wasn't strong.
Right, yeah. My parents were people of faith, but the faith was very Americanized. This is what it was very American, suburban, middle-class, American, Midwestern Catholicism. It was Catholicism fit into the mold of America, okay, and American values of that time. And there's pluses and minuses to that. And I grew up a very happy boy. And my parents were great parents, and I had a lovely childhood. But the Catholic roots were not of a profound intellectual sort of, energizing sort of thing. It was like, okay, I'm confirmed. Now I don't have to do catechism anymore. And, I'm just imbibing the values of my culture. And eventually those values led me into atheism. Oh. And so by the time I got to, I would say, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, high school, I started searching for meaning in life. I started to become dissatisfied with the atheism. As you mature and you grow older, those kinds of childhood, fixations on astronomy and dinosaurs and evolution give way to questions of meaning. What is my place in life? What is my purpose in life? So I was at a public high school, Lincoln High School, and this was back in the day when, I don't know, the ACLU hadn't been invented yet or something. My public high school allowed this evangelical Christian group called Young Life. Are you familiar with Young Life?
I was with Young Life for about 5 years, so I know it very well, yeah.
Yeah, so they allowed these guys to just roam the hallways of our high school, handing out little pocket New Testaments and little pamphlets on born-again evangelical Christianity. And so I was very smitten with that all of a sudden. And then one day, one of them got me to read this little book by this unknown guy I'd never heard of before, Hal Lindsey, called The Late Great Planet Earth. And for your viewers who don't know, that he was a Protestant evangelical, what we call it theologically, a dispensationalist, that God deals with history in different dispensations. But that dispensationalist school believed in the whole fulfillment of Bible prophecy, that Jesus was coming soon, that Russia was predicted in Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog, and there was going to be a great war with Israel, and the whole bit. And boy, I just became absolutely convinced of this sort of end of the world, born again, Josh McDowell, evidence that demands a verdict kind of Protestantism. And boy, I threw myself into it. I would get into all these raging debates with so many of my friends in the school cafeteria after school, because my friends were also the bookish, nerdy types. And so they were idea people, and most of them were atheists and agnostics or just liberal religious people. And so we would go at it hammer and tongs, sometimes far into the night on these issues. Then I got into young earth creationism and was arguing for the literalness of Noah's Ark and the literalness of the flood, and so flood geology, and would go to these speakers on flood geology. So the picture is, man, I was so far away from Catholicism, and I bought hook, line, and sinker into the ideology that went along often with a lot of it, that Rome was the whore of Babylon predicted in the book of Revelation, and that I had been raised essentially as an idolater, to worship Mary and to bow down to a cookie and all that kind of stuff, of the worst kind.
Our guest is Dr. Larry Chapp. Again, I'm going to step back a little bit. As I said, I was with Young Life after I graduated from college and was an engineer, and so I was a speaker for Young Life. And Larry, that points out something about groups like that. On the one hand, Young Life is one of the most successful non-Catholic Christian outreaches to youth. It really was. But it shows you that because it was non-denominational, it could open the door to all kinds of ideas, because the ideas that you bought into were not officially Young Life ideas.
Oh, no, not at all. And there were many people I knew in Young Life who would have been appalled at it was just a guy here, a guy there, a gal here, a gal there, that would whisper these ideas to you or hand you a little book that had these ideas. Because you're right, being non-denominational and non-creedal, there was no oversight or anything like that.
There was no discussion on sacraments, no discussion on ecclesiology. There was nothing like that. It was, on the one hand, it was good. It was about Jesus. I mean, praise God for that.
Yes.
But it opened the door for all these other views. And the example for you is, not only are you pulled out of the Catholic Church, but you pick up the anti-Catholic jargon.
Oh, absolutely. And I think to some extent the people who ran Young Life are very similar to a lot of the evangelical television ministries that were out there at the time too. They tended publicly to mute their criticism of Catholicism, knowing that a lot of their newfound members were former Catholics who still maybe had one foot in the Catholic door. Even as I'm sending money to Pat Robertson, I'm still going to Catholic Mass, right? So Pat Robertson isn't going to blast the Catholic Church as much as he might do in private, but then, okay, so there I am, this young evangelical, completely abandoned my Catholic faith, thought it was a form of idolatry. So, and I had abandoned really my Catholic faith even before I became an evangelical because of my scientific atheistic phase. So I will say this, there is, I don't look back with any regrets.
Right.
Everything in your life is a stepping stone. And I will tell you this, what drew me to science was as a young man, I had a very empirical mind. A mind that wanted things proven to it. I wanted to see evidences. And I didn't see any evidence that the Catholic Church is right. I saw lots of evidence that science was right. So then along comes this evangelical Protestant push that says, hey, we can prove the Bible to you. We can prove to you this fulfillment of prophecy. We can prove to you that the Bible is now coming true before. That's what really struck me about Hal Lindsey. It's like, this proves the Bible's true, because he's right. All this stuff is coming true. Oh my goodness! And if the Bible is right,
you mentioned Josh McDowell too.
Oh, Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Right.
That was huge for me.
Yep,
okay.
Yep.
But then I was always going to this evangelical Christian bookstore in downtown Lincoln called Logos Bookstore.
Oh, yep.
Great guy who ran it, guy named Bart Larson. I don't know if he's still with us or if he's with the Lord. Nice man. He said he saw that I was starting to have deeper questions than what these various books were providing me with. And he goes, you might be interested in this guy named C.S. Lewis. And we have some of his books over here. So I bought Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and devoured it like in one night. So I'm one of these typical, I sort of read my way if you will, out of the Catholic faith. And now I'm reading my way back into the Catholic faith, which is, I guess, what little nerd intellectual kids do. Well, I was a young adult at this point. But as I'm reading Lewis, it struck me, this is not really the kind of Christianity that these other books like Hal Lindsey and Josh McDowell are talking about. And then I started reading some of his other books, and he mentions this guy named G.K. Chesterton. And so I thought, who's this Chesterton? So I read Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, and all of a sudden, oh boy. And Chesterton mentioned this guy named Cardinal Newman. So I went to the downtown Lincoln Bennett Martin Public Library and checked out. They had one book by Newman. It was a collection of some of his sermons. And I was reading those. And literally, the scales came off my eyes. And I really started to suddenly realize that I had come home, that I had come all the way back home.
What age were you coming home? What age were you reading Newman and Chesterton?
About age 20.
Okay, all right.
About age 20. Like I said, I mean, I'm not pushing myself as this, this wunderkind, genius little, but I was a bookish, intellectual kid going all the way back to when I was, 7 years old, 8 years old, just who I am. That's my journey. My journey is a journey of ideas. It's a journey of a young, bookish, intellectually oriented kid in, very middle class, blue collar, Lincoln, Nebraska.
Are you of the ilk that sometimes God lets us go with the ultimate goal of bringing us back? In other words, he lets you drift with the ultimate goal of awakening you to bring you back?
Absolutely, and I would say that to anybody out there, when at age 63, one of the greatest things you can do is to do a life examine as you get older. I'm sure you have too, Marcus. Yeah. And one of the things I have really, really learned is, other than my sins, my overt sins that were destructive of other people, I don't regret any of the intellectual and religious movements of my life. Either my movement away from Catholicism into atheism, and then into fundamentalist evangelicalism, and then back into Catholicism. Because even when I came back to Catholicism, I came back as a kind of very, very immature, fire-breathing, heresy-hunting, super uber Catholic, who wanted every Catholic to be, theologically and doctrinally pure. And then I go off to the seminary, and I was probably one of the most annoying seminarians that my professors at seminary could run, because I was both intelligent and bookish, and intelligent in a bookish way. And so I excelled in my classes. But I'm sure in terms of priestly formation, I never made it to priesthood, but in terms of seminary formation, they probably were banging their heads against the wall at this young, immature, brash, loudmouth guy,
Well, you've jumped ahead a little bit because I don't think the audience realized you had spent some time in seminary. So we'll get there.
Yes.
But
yeah.
Before we get there, I want another question for you. One thing I've found over the years I'm a Catholic now almost 30 years, is that often the most vehement anti-Catholics that I encounter in our work with the Coming Home Network are often ex-Catholics who are now vehemently anti-Catholic. But what you find is that part of the problem was they really didn't know the faith very well in the first place.
Correct.
So when they leave, now they're anti-Catholic, but they really didn't know it. So in your case, I could see some echoes of that, but now that you're back solid in the faith, did you have to relearn the faith all over again?
Oh, I did. In fact, when I was at the Newman Center, I was at the University of Nebraska at the time when I was making the decision to go to seminary.
Studying what? What were you studying?
I was a philosophy major at the University of Nebraska because I was already, there was no theology degree or really a religion degree worth paying attention to at the University of Nebraska. So I thought the closest thing to studying about metaphysics and big picture ideas was philosophy, and it turned out to be true. And so I was at the university, and I went to the Newman Center there, and there was a very vibrant Newman Center on the campus, University of Nebraska. And one of the things that Bishop Flavin at the time mandated was that all new seminarians had to take this course taught by the priest at the Newman Center on the Catholic faith. And I resented that because I thought, I've read Newman, I've read Chesterton. I was astounded at how much I did not know. And like I didn't really understand the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I didn't. I thought that I did. But I was kind of shocked and stunned when it was really explained to me for the first time. I think I had really harbored what was essentially maybe a kind of Lutheran concept that it's both bread and the body of Christ, all right? It's got to be both, right? But that course really then shook me up a little bit and say, oh, wait a minute, okay, maybe not.
I'm wondering if in the process of doing that, a part of that journey was, we see this in the Old Testament, we see it all through church history, is this the importance of the both and when it comes to sacramental life and internal conversion, faith. And the danger is we can have people that know the sacramental life, the externals, but without the internal awakening. And then we can have a reaction against that and abandon the sacramental life and only emphasize the internal, if you will. That's kind of what Luther and the gang did. But when you come back to the church, you have to rediscover both. Right? You had to rediscover the sacramental life and what it really meant, but also it's about Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, at first, when I first started my reversion, obviously I was an evangelical and everything was about Jesus, 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 and the scriptures and the scriptures. So at first my conversion back to the church was really a conversion back to the idea of a magisterium, the idea that the church was a medium of revelation, just like, lesser than the Bible, but nevertheless, it's the home of the Bible. So that whole notion of tradition, magisterium. So I did, the last thing that really I had to learn was the importance of the sacraments themselves, the sacraments as such, and realize that they're actually superior to them in themselves, to the magisterium. And the magisterium is in the service of those things. Lex orandi, lex credendi.
Yeah. So, I mean, you had gone through confession, you had gone through confirmation, you had gone through these, if you will,
confession.
You've gone through those things, but had you understood them?
No, and I'm glad you brought up confession. Confession was, like, I think for a lot of simply new converts to Catholicism, let alone reverts, confession was a huge stumbling block for me because for whatever reason, I was confirmed in the 3rd grade. And I think it was explained to me at the time was because that's when the bishop's schedule brought him around to where we were. You have to remember, the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska encompasses all of southern Nebraska, which is a vast expanse. And so the bishop planned his, there was no auxiliary bishop to help him. And so I think that's why I got confirmed in the 3rd grade. But the point is, that was the last time I ever went to confession. Because it was just, this was the 60s. Even among really devout Catholics, the teaching from a lot of quarters in the church then was just worship, just, confess your sins to God. You don't need that priest. It was a very Protestant ethos. And I had that, and I hadn't been to confession since 3rd grade. Well, maybe even 2nd grade, because that's when I made First Communion. But anyway, I remember when I was at the Newman Center and thinking, well, oh, gee, I better go to confession. And I think that first confession after I reverted was maybe about an hour long as I went through a whole life thing.
Larry, another thing I'd love you to talk about is, we hear your story, and you were born in 58. You're confirmed 2nd, 3rd grade. What would that year be about?
Well, let's see, 62, probably about 1965, I would say, about 1965.
A significant year in the history of the church, and then you come back to the church, maybe when you're 20, so we're talking 78. I mean, talk about what's going on in the church during the time you're leaving and rediscovering Catholicism.
Yeah, what's going on in the church is insanity. What the great George Weigel calls the silly season of the church. And a lot of you've lived through it too, Marcus, although you were probably a Protestant at the time,
Right.
but you could still observe it. But I lived it, and I remember thinking as a young man in my atheistic phase, this just proves how stupid this whole thing is. I remember seeing, insanities like clown masses and priests trying to consecrate. I remember one time a priest trying to consecrate a popcorn ball and Coca-Cola because that's what's relevant to people of today. People think I'm making that up. No, priests were doing that kind of insanity. Bishop Robert Barron, who I had an interview with, likes to talk about when he's the same age as I am. He talks about how a priest rode a motorcycle up the aisle of his. That was the entrance to Mass, was he rode a motorcycle up the aisle. And then, of course, on top of all that, there was massive dissent from church teaching, especially after Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae on contraception. You had moral theologians like McCormick and Curran and Bernard Herring dissenting. And so there was this massive theological experimentation, liturgical experimentation, priests and nuns leaving the priesthood in droves, Paul VI being a wounded and crippled pope after the massive rejection of 1968, and of course the massive cultural revolution of those times, anti-war, civil rights, Watergate, all those things. It was just as if the world was coming apart in front of us. And so what you sought was a safe haven, a safe port in the storm.
Yeah.
And I think that was why so many evangelicals drifted into fundamentalism. And then when I reverted, even as a young Catholic, you come in and you're looking for rock solid orthodoxy. And of course, that's a good thing to have rock solid orthodoxy. But there's also a way of approaching that is too narrow.
Yeah.
That can be, yeah.
I was going to say, and there were a lot of voices at that time. And the audience, you lifelong Catholics can remember that time. And so imagine somebody coming back wanting to find rock solid Catholicism with all the voices out there of the different angles of Catholicism. Larry, we're going to take a break now, come back in a couple minutes. I'd like to pick up right there. You're trying to discover the real Catholicism.
That's right. That's right. That's what I was trying to do.
And eventually that led to seminary and professorship and a Catholic worker farm, so we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. So all of you, I want to remind you before we take the break, go to chnetwork.org. That's the Coming Home Network's website if you want to find more conversion stories like Larry's, but we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, and our guest tonight is Dr. Larry Chapp. I had mentioned just before the break, Larry, the Coming Home Network website, chnetwork.org, but I also want to, before you jump back into your story, you have this one word, gaudium-et-spes22.com. That's your blog site. What would they find if they went to that?
Oh, they find at my blog a combination essentially of two things. Number one, a lot of my written theological essays on all kinds of theological topics that some people have found helpful. And that's really how I started, and that's how the blog kind of went viral. People started printing off and sharing my blog posts. But then I got into doing video interviews, YouTube channel. So they'll also find a whole bunch of interviews with mainly a bunch of bearded white theologian men who are talking theology, big idea. Basically all these people that I knew from my theological years as a professor that I'm known. And that's how I really got to know you, as you were reading my blog, and then you agreed graciously to come on and do a couple of I think 3 maybe YouTube videos with me, 2 or 3.
I think we've done 2. We've been hesitant on the 3rd because you've been wondering if another appearance of me might destroy your career. But But let's.
I don't think that was it. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, okay, and we'll get back to that a little bit. Okay, let's get back into your story. So you've come back to the church, and as we mentioned before the break, it's kind of like, what's real Catholicism? I mean, what is, you've abandoned what you thought was, and it wasn't, and then the crazy time, silly time, and now you come back to the church, and so in some ways, the coming back to the church was also a change in your career direction, I am assuming.
Yeah, my career choice went from being, because early on at the University of Nebraska, my thought was, I'm going to major in philosophy. Maybe I'll go on to get a PhD in philosophy or theology and become an academic, because I was just so oriented to the world of books. But the more and more I thought about it, the more I felt truly called to the priesthood. At least I thought I did. But there's a story, I guess, in and of itself of how to discern vocations. To remain open to the Holy Spirit, no matter how certain you become. Yeah. But nevertheless, I decided, okay, I'm going to pursue this priesthood thing. And through it all, like I said, it's a silly season. And it's very important for your viewers to understand, many of them might be aware of the fact that the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska, of which I was a part, was considered to be, a very orthodox, conservative diocese, and it was. Bishop Glenn Patrick Flavin kept the silly season out of Lincoln. Yep. And even though it crept in, I was introduced to the silly season basically when we'd travel elsewhere, even up Interstate 80 to Omaha, which was its own diocese, which had descended into madness at the time. At least it seemed to me. I probably hadn't, but it seemed to me. But anyway, my point is that I was very self-conscious as a seminarian with my fellow Lincoln seminarians and from other conservative dioceses like Wichita and Arlington. We all got sent to these conservative seminaries, and so we were rubbing shoulders with fellow conservative seminarians from conservative dioceses, and our self-awareness, our sense of mission and vocation was, we're going to save the church. The whole rest of the church is in heresy, is burning down. We are going to be the salvation of the church. Hence why we were all such sort of heresy-hunting, fire-breathing, puritanical, moralizing little, little inquisitors. Let's put it that way. I'm exaggerating, obviously, to make a point. Most of these guys are now priests, and they're wonderful priests. But then came John Paul II in 1978. And to us, it seemed like a knight in shining armor had just ridden into the castle. It's like Gandalf returning to save people at, I don't know which, Helm's Deep, on the third, look to me on the third day, look to the horizon on the third day, and in comes Gandalf to save Helm's Deep. And that's the way we looked at John Paul II. I wish, and you're the same, I could communicate to the younger viewers out there just how inspiring John Paul II was to our generation of Catholics who did see themselves as besieged by this overwhelming cultural and ecclesial tsunami that we didn't know what. So I didn't know it at the time, but what I was in search of was real Catholicism. Mm-hmm. What is the church? Or better, who is the church? And that has taken me a lifetime to discern.
Yeah. You talked about the issue of discernment of priesthood. You decided no,
right,
but didn't abandon your mission.
No, I sort of, once again, another reverse. I reverted back to the idea that I wasn't called to the priesthood, that I was confusing a call to academic theology with a call to priesthood. And I had confused those two things, because the closer and closer I got to priesthood, the more I realized I wasn't drawn to ministry, not to priestly ministry, sacramental ministry. I wasn't drawn to that. What I realized was what I was really looking forward to was preaching. What I was really looking forward to was being able to stand up in a pulpit and give a homily, to talk some theology with people. And that began to dawn on me more and more. What you want to be is a teacher. Yeah. What you want to be is a professor of theology. And so I backed away, left the seminary, and then went on to Fordham University in the Bronx, where I got my doctorate in 1994.
I was reading recently, rereading a book by Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, and I was reading also another book you recommended. Right now, my mind can't, I'm missing it, about a great writer. But both of them talked about the importance of education, the education.
Yes.
Schumacher's almost thought more about the smallness and all that, but really it was a voice about the key is this importance of education. I've heard you talk about in your own blog the importance of education, and maybe that's one of the bigger problems in our world, in our culture right now, is the mess up of education. But it sounds like what you were recognizing is that your calling itself, given your own insufficient formation of the Catholic Church, and then your false formation, is we got to cut this through and get to the authentic education of what is true.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the catechetical formation I received as a young man was insufficient, not because it was heretical or wrong. It's just that catechesis by itself is not sufficient. Catechesis by itself does not necessarily rise to an education in the faith unless it sinks in, unless it seeps in. And that means that a good catechist has to be, in this day and age, a bit of an evangelist, which means a bit of an educator beyond just the bits and pieces of doctrine and dogma, which means that you have to, as I often say, flip the script in the minds of your young'uns. Because they have a certain tape, a certain narrative plane that's been given to them by the culture. And if you just drop catechism bits on them over here, that tape is just going to push those catechism bits out. And that's why so many parents are losing their kids from the faith. It's not that the parents are bad Catholics or that the catechists are bad catechists. It's just that we need to understand this profound change that has happened in our culture, requiring a different kind of education that begins with catechesis but does not end there. I remember when I was a professor of theology, I was department chair at DeSales University, which is near Allentown, PA. I had to actually dismiss a couple of very orthodox and devout adjunct professors of theology, part-time professors, who would just fill in the gaps for us with our staffing, because their approach to teaching theology to undergraduates was strictly catechetical. And it just didn't fly. I mean, they could pat themselves on the back and say, well, I taught them about the real presence and the Trinity and the Christological doctrines of the church and this, that, and the other encyclical that I had them read. And yet none of it sank in because they didn't engage the students on an evangelical cultural level as to why they should give a hoot about any of it in the first place. So yeah, my calling was to be an educator of a certain sort.
Yeah. Well, and you still are. You still are in ways that you didn't anticipate. I mean, you're writing for Catholic World Report, and as you mentioned, you recently had an article in National Catholic Register. But before we get to all that, I have one other thing about education. Because you can make a list, just as you started to rattle off a second ago, you know, important key points of education. And we got to make sure they get through the basics. But you might get to one that, but I'm not going to talk about the devil very much. I'm not going to talk about hell very much. I'm not going to talk about judgment. That's uncomfortable. So, but I'm going to give everything else, and it's all solid, everything, but I'm not going to talk about the devil. And my view is, we look at the mess we're in today, both in the world and in the church, maybe the biggest problem is that people believe all this stuff, but they don't believe the reality of the devil anymore. And so as a result, as Paul Harvey once said, if we don't believe in the devil, then he's free to do whatever he wants to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a blog post coming out probably today or tomorrow where I'm talking about Satan and the essence of the demonic. I think one of the reasons why a lot of educators shy away from talking about Satan, hell, damnation, judgment is because of certain cultural baggage or images that have accrued around those things. Hellfire, brimstone, pitchforks, you know, all the medieval imagery that is still with us, some of what I kind of like artistically, but the imagery is still with us. To get more theological about who Satan is and what hell is, less imaginistic and more deeply theological. Read some of the things by Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, on hell and judgment and Satan, and even Pope Francis on just what the demonic actually is. And when you analyze that theologically, what you begin to understand is that the demonic is the realm of deception, illusions, lies. It is the realm of unreality masquerading as reality. And the goal is to get people to see that the so-called reality that they have bought into is really an illusion, and unreality is Satan. Yeah. And that the true reality is Christ, and he alone liberates from the principalities and powers that hold you in these illusions. I think people need to hear this message that Satan is he who promotes lies, the lies of illusion and unreality that enslave us.
And when you talk about authentic, full, engaged education,
yes,
and our young people in our culture today, to a very young age, are being educated in bizarre ideas. And
yes,
if they're unaware that there's another influence going on in their head, then they can be convinced to believe about themselves bizarre things.
And a lot of people, though, it's not hard to flip that script, because you just nailed it, Marcus. The things that they're being told to believe and that they're just sort of buying in hook, line, and sinker because, like you said, they don't have anything else in their head. They're things that go against common sense. All right? Like, you know, everybody really knows that a man can't get pregnant. Okay? And we can be taught that over and over by our overlords these days, that men can indeed get pregnant, you bigot. No, men cannot get pregnant. I can put on army boots. It doesn't make me a Marine. And everybody instinctively knows this. Everybody instinctively knows that when a woman is pregnant, she's carrying a human life. We all instinctively know this. What needs to be therefore done in any good Catholic education is that those illusions simply have to be exposed for the lies that they are, but done so in a very sophisticated and in some ways non-judgmental way. You know, to not finger wag, not be judgmental, just to come in with a sort of humorous sort of, you know, pin to prick these absurd balloons. It's not hard to do. A little humor goes a long way in education, I think.
Yeah, we're living at a time when prayer is so needed, but also people that are brave enough and convicted enough to take a stand for what's true, no matter what happens around them. It's really...
And I want to go back, absolutely, that these illusions that young people today have bought into, not only do they sort of know in their common sense that they're not true, to go back to our conversation about the demonic and Satan, and going back to my own narrative and journey and how many illusions I bought into, young people today are looking for liberation from the slavery that they need to be able to name their slavery. They feel enslaved, but they don't know to what they are enslaved. Yeah. Okay, and so the role of the great Catholic educator is to show them the nature of their enslavement. This is what St. Paul did, right? He showed his pagan Greco-Roman folks the nature of their enslavement, and therefore the nature of Christ's liberation. And I think that's simply a method that works. I think it really works, and it's a way that you can bring in the demonic and judgment and hell, you know, quite easily.
Yep, and when you read St. Paul, you also remember that he had to say over and over again, this is where you were, just don't go back there. Because the battle is, as he said, principalities and powers, you know, and it's a constant struggle. And so why we have to work through all the silliness that's still around us in the church to make sure that we're holding on to that which is solid. And
absolutely.
Now, because of time, I want to make sure we get off to the Catholic Worker Farm, because I mean, you were happy and jolly, all light, and what did Woodhouse always say? All light and brightness, as a professor at the sales, and then you had the radical idea of changing all that.
Yes, and it came from the fact, once again, I read myself once again into a different vocation, because I had been teaching in my theology classes, especially in those sections where you dealt with economic justice and other issues of social justice, I began teaching the writings of Dorothy Day and her co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, Peter Morin. And what I was trying to get my students to see was how timely and prophetic and ahead of her time her ideas were. I mean, she had a reputation during her life, and then among obviously many Orthodox Catholics today, she's like this radical liberal, right? A Marxist almost, but she wasn't. She was actually a very, very Orthodox Catholic, even to the point of all the church's sexual teachings, everything. She bought it all. But yeah, she was a pacifist. And yes, she was all in favor of the poor and social justice. She opposed the economic injustices of our society. So I'm teaching this, and it just began to dawn on me more and more and more that if I believe what Dorothy Day is saying, that I perhaps need to do more than simply teach about helping the poor, teach about getting back to the land, getting back to a simpler, less ornate lifestyle. And then I started examining my life as a college professor, which was, I don't mean to offend professors out there, but our lives are quite cushy. I enjoyed it. In fact, I think it's perhaps 50% of the reason why people become professors, because the lifestyle is quite pleasant. Lots of vacation time. The teaching schedule is not as onerous as, say, a high school teacher. And I was making a good salary, and I was taking trips to Rome twice a year, and my wife and I were going to fine restaurants every night. And my wife also has a PhD in theology, Dr. Carmina Chapp. So we would have nice theological conversations over pasta amatriciana and Piazza Navona in Rome. And it just started to hit me, I'm not walking the walk. And even though I greatly enjoyed being an educator and bringing people to the faith, I felt like a bit of a fraud. So I wanted to actually live the corporal works of mercy more. And
I'm wondering, I'm gonna, because I want to jump in there, parallel experience. I think when I was discovering the issue of small farms and all those issues, reading books on this, Dorothy Day and other things, what I was finding is that I was fully surrendered and in love with Jesus Christ, and had dedicated my life to follow him no matter where. But I began to realize that I was following a truncated gospel. I was blind to how so many of us in America, maybe the world, but at least in America, we're gung-ho for the gospel we know, but there are parts of it we ignore. And to me, that's what people like Dorothy Day and Peter awakened us.
Yes. One of the things that allowed Catholics, I think, to ignore, as you correctly put it, certain aspects, say, of the Sermon on the Mount, was that there was a kind of distinction that had crept into Catholic theology that made a distinction between the way of the evangelical counsels, poverty, chastity, obedience, and the way of the commandments. And it was thought, for the laity, the way of the commandments is enough. Just honor your father, mother, don't commit adultery, all that stuff. But really, the more radical, as Bishop Barron calls them, the spiritual athletes, as he calls them, those were in the religious orders. So the Sermon on the Mount, the evangelical counsels, those are for the super spiritual athletes there in our convents and monasteries, priests and nuns. That's for the celibates. People who are married with kids, they don't have time for holiness. Come on. And that is what Dorothy Day rose up against. And she insisted, yes, there is a distinction to be made between counsels, which are calls to perfection, and commandments, which are, in a sense, the minimum. But nevertheless, we are all called to live the evangelical counsels, and her vision came to fruition in the Second Vatican Council in the document Lumen Gentium. The church is, the light of the nations. In Lumen Gentium chapter 5, where the council reiterates the universal call to holiness. That's what drew me to Dorothy Day, that universal call to holiness. And I was inspired by that. And I was, 20 years a professor, feeling the burn, feeling like I can't possibly open up another blue book and grade another incoherent essay. I need to get back to the land and do what Dorothy said.
Yeah, there's that that verse in Hebrews. I won't try and find it because of time, but it says that we are to pursue the peace and holiness apart from which we cannot see God.
That's right. And I felt that's so good, because I felt like I wasn't seeing God. And this is part of my journey, and why I've emphasized over and over again to your viewers that I read myself into this and I read myself into that. Because the great danger of the intellectual is that you live in your head and you live with your ideas, but those ideas never take root in you. Never take root in you. And so I felt like I knew a lot about God, but I felt like I didn't know God, that I didn't know Jesus. And so this final step, this final reversion in my life away from that blue-collar boy in Lincoln, Nebraska in the 60s, is to finally see God in the land and in the people that come here.
And so you've learned farming. Your wife learned farming too?
Oh yes, she's a Jersey girl. She didn't know anything about farming.
We have about 4 minutes left. I'd love to talk more about farming, but I also, another big voice that you have right now, especially on your blog and in your writings for Catholic World Report, is as a defender of the Second Vatican Council. And
yes,
you had done your work in your PhD on Balthasar, and you were, in my mind, one of the resident experts on the ressourcement theologians that had such an impact on Vatican II. Talk a little bit about, in some way, your journey was a rediscovery of what Vatican II was all about.
Yes, because I had largely blamed Vatican II as a young man for all of the turmoil that I saw around me. And so I was a kind of early trad in my own. I didn't call it that. I read things like The Wanderer, you know, and felt like, okay, Vatican II is a valid council, but man, I hated it for all the destruction it brought. And so, yeah, part of my reversion is a rediscovery of the beauty of the Second Vatican Council, which not only do I think did not cause the destruction, I think it is a prophetic voice, a powerful voice, and remains almost completely untapped. And it pains me that the pontificates of Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict, in their retrieval of the council, just does not seem, it seemed to me at the time that it was sinking deeply into the church. And yet it does not seem that that is necessarily the case. So there's a lot of things in the council that I think need retrieval. One is the universal call to holiness. One is Dei Verbum, the document on Revelation, where the council updated Catholic theology with regard to the sources of revelation. I don't have time to go into all of that here. I think that's more timely than ever. I think Lumen Gentium's discussion of what it means to say that there's no salvation outside of the church is more timely than ever. It's ecumenical discussions, and you would be interested in this, obviously, with regard to our separated brothers and sisters in Protestant communions. You know, the Coming Home Network, you know, and the council is perhaps changing the reasons why it wants people to come home. Okay, it's changing in very subtle ways the reasons why it's good for Protestants to come home. And I think that, we can talk about that, but I don't think we have time. I think that remains an untapped resource of the council. What is salvation, and what role does the church play in that salvation? And therefore, what role do individual Catholics play in salvation? That isn't necessarily maybe always what we think it is. So yeah, my blog it's Gaudium et Spes, which was one of the documents of the council, the church in the modern world. And the 22nd chapter of Gaudium et Spes is a chapter that John Paul II helped write and quoted in every one of his encyclicals. It's section 22, where it says, only in the light of Christ does the mystery of man make sense. In other words, you can't understand human beings unless you know Christ. That's the Christological core and center of the whole council. So I called my blog, all one word, gaudiumetsspes22.com, in order to point out that I'm going to retrieve the council Christologically, which is also my way of also paying homage to my evangelical past.
I remember Augustine making a statement about this issue of no salvation outside the church, and it seemed that the point he was trying to make was, you can have all kinds of things outside the church, but you can't be certain that you have what's true.
Right.
And so, and the issue of holiness, isn't that what Vatican II in some ways was kind of cutting through, so everyone can know the importance of holiness for the sake of salvation?
Yeah, absolutely. The purpose of the church is clarity and to bring the peace that certitude brings, that we have the truth. It doesn't mean everybody outside of the church is damned, but it does mean it's easier inside the church than outside. This is a safer boat than those boats you were in.
Dr. Chapp, thank you so much for joining us on the journey home.
Thank you.
What a great pleasure. Again, I want to tell the audience to go to gaudium@spes22.com to find out more about what you're writing and what you're speaking on, and look for your articles in Catholic World Report and maybe another article in National Catholic Register. Thank you, my friend, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Marcus. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And all of you, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Dr. Chapp's witness is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.